Hi everybody, I'm Bruce Miller with Oakwood Cemetery. Robin Simonton is behind the camera, and we are going to do another virtual tour today. She tells me this is number 14, but before we do that one, I want to go back to two that we did earlier. If you've been paying attention, you saw that we did two tours on NC State. And I made some mistakes on that, and I don't want to leave you with mistakes. We don't have time to tell you everything about the subjects we cover, but what we don't want to do is give you wrong information. So anyway, on NC State number 1, I said that in going through the 1903 yearbook, it looked like only one student out of that class of 03 studied architecture, I said. I didn't mean that at all. I meant agriculture. But two words of more than 2 syllables starting with the same letter confused me. Anyway, my point was that a school that began as, in part anyway, great part an agricultural school, only had one out of some, 30 or 40 in that class that were in agriculture as opposed to engineering. And the other, in NC State number 2, I said that the Reynolds Coliseum structure they began building it before World War I. It was before World War II. Once again, the W's must have confused me, or I was thinking of Frank Thompson. Anyway, yes, they had to stop building Reynolds because of the Second World War, not the First World War. If in fact you see factual errors that I've made in any of these presentations, if you let Robin know, we can correct them, because we hate to give out bad information. Anyway, today a somewhat different format for us. Our topic today is newspapers. I have one with me. This is a newspaper, a local newspaper, one a lot of you know, particularly if you're an older person. I suspect there are some young people out there who may be watching this that don't pay much attention to newspapers. Maybe they've never read one, and that's part of the point today. Things are changing now as we go to electronics. The iPhone that Robin is filming with, if she were to press some other buttons, could give far more information than this and most other newspapers all put together. But in the old days, in the last several centuries, certainly in Raleigh and anywhere, newspapers were your primary social medium. Newspapers told you everything you needed to know, what was going on, what was happening, anything about business or sports, humor, entertainment, society, obituaries that help make newspapers important to cemeteries, of course. Now they seem to be fading, and I suspect will become something of the past. But in terms of the history of newspapers in Raleigh, Oakwood is rich in it. In fact, I was surprised as we went back to prepare this talk just how many people we have in Oakwood Cemetery who are associated with newspapers, either as newspaper owners or as reporters and journalists and so forth. And we're going to do a few of them anyway. We won't have a chance to get to them all by any means. And we thought we would do them chronologically. That is, put them in, even though it's difficult because there's a great deal of overlap, but we thought we'd start with the earliest newspapers and work up to the present. To do that, to be honest about the topic, we couldn't do it all in Oakwood Cemetery. That's why, those of you who may be familiar with it, we are in City Cemetery to begin, because the folks who started our earliest newspapers in the city of Raleigh lived and died before Oakwood Cemetery was created. So when they passed away, they were buried in City Cemetery. The first 2 newspapers were begun in Raleigh in 1799 within months of each other. And we are at the graveside of newspaper number 2. That's the Raleigh Register. And it was begun by a fellow named Joseph Gales. This is Gales' lawn crypt. You see, it's not been very well cared for, I'm afraid. Robin wouldn't tolerate that in Oakwood. Joseph Gales, an Englishman, came to the U.S. with his family in the 1790s, started the Raleigh Register at the end of just before the turn of that century. It was a newspaper heavily political, as were most of the early ones. In fact, that's one reason that a lot of people started newspapers, was to get their political voice out. Raleigh, being the capital, became what was called a newspaper town, in part because of its politics. In fact, the archives, North Carolina archives, tell us that in the 19th century, there were over 100 newspapers that came and went, most of them very short-lived, and most of them very political. In fact, archives tells us that at one point there were 13 newspapers in Raleigh going at the same time. Again, political voices wanted to be heard. That was certainly true for Joseph Gales, what would be called today a progressive, liberal, in those days a Jeffersonian. He had a rival, though, the fellow who started newspaper number 1 in Raleigh, who's right nearby. And if you'll come with us. All right, Robin and I have come about 30 yards from Joseph Gales to the gravesite of William Boylan. William Boylan from New Jersey came south, and he started Raleigh's first newspaper in mid-1799 called the Minerva. Now, Minerva was the Roman goddess of wisdom, so you can see, I think, what he thought of his paper and what he hoped the public would glean from it. In fact, some of our newspapers over the years, as you'll see, had some pretty curious names. But anyway, his was Minerva, and it ran for about 10 years. Now, unlike Gales, who was a Jeffersonian, William Boylan in part began the Minerva because he was a staunch Federalist, what today we would consider a conservative. So you had the conservative Minerva within just a few months versus the more progressive, if you will, Raleigh Register. And the two men were vigorous rivals initially, anyway, before they became much more companions. In fact, a famous incident from early Raleigh has the two men in the middle of Fayetteville Street in a vicious fight, for which Boylan was apparently fined £100, which is a significant sum of money in, this was the early 1800s. After that, they became reasonably good friends. In fact, at one point, for some reason or other, I can't remember what, Gales' presses went down, and William Boylan allowed him to use the presses for Minerva to run off the latest edition of the Raleigh Register. The Minerva only lasted about 10 years. I think Boylan went on to other things. There are many Boylan descendants in Oakwood Cemetery, though none that we know stayed in the newspaper business. That's different from Joseph Gales, whom you will hear about later. Anyway, William Boylan with a nice big stone and a nice big lot in City Cemetery. We have one more. And just a few yards behind William Boylan, we come to another gravesite, an attractive marker. This is in memory of the Reverend Thomas Meredith. And if that name sounds familiar to you, it should, because he gave it to the school later on. But he was not only a churchman, but he became a newspaper man, a prominent newspaper man. I believe his newspaper was newspaper number 5 in Raleigh, and of all the papers that we talk about today, his is the only one that's still publishing. That's from the 1830s. That's our little quiz for today. Name Meredith's paper. Anyway, he's here in City Cemetery because, as you can see, he died long before Oakwood Cemetery was founded. And it's to Oakwood Cemetery that we go now to see how newspapers evolved through the years. All right, thanks for coming with us back to Oakwood. We're in the Linden Lawn section, and here's a name I suspect you recognize. This is Seaton Gales. The Raleigh Register originally went to Joseph Gales' son Weston, who's buried in City Cemetery next to his dad. This is the grandson, Seaton Gales, the grandson of Joseph Gales, and Seaton Gales took over the Raleigh Register and ran it to the 1850s, but had a number of firsts to his name. He is said to be the first university-trained editor of a North Carolina paper. He went to UNC. Oddly enough, I'm not sure that's where he learned it, but he became the first newspaperman, perhaps in the country, to use stenography. Very helpful to a journalist if he's taking notes. He was one of the first in North Carolina to use a telegraph to receive news, and he did run in 1850 on a sort of an experimental basis the first daily version of the Raleigh Register, but the town was too small to support it. Remember, there were only a few thousand people in Raleigh before the Civil War, much too small to support a daily newspaper. He also, I should mention, was the state printer. And I should have mentioned this earlier. One of the things that newspapers in Raleigh competed vigorously for, because for many it was life or death, was who would hold the contract for that year to print state documents. Apparently the state didn't have presses on its own. It was the newspapermen who had the printing presses, and so it was the newspapermen who printed state documents under contract, and that made the difference between profit and loss. So they fought vigorously for it. Quite literally, you're going to meet two men who actually fought in the state capitol for that contract. Anyway, Seaton Gales, very important in the history of North Carolina newspapers, as you might imagine. He sold it in the 1850s to a man named John Syme. John Syme is not here, but his son is here, and he was a newspaperman too. Come with us to see young Mr. Syme. We've come to the Anderson section to visit with the son of the fellow who purchased the Raleigh Register. This is John Cameron Syme. His father was a Virginian, purchased the Raleigh Register, and tried to make a go of it. But John, before that, was in Raleigh after the Civil War. The Civil War was not very kind to John Syme. He was wounded badly at the Wilderness, and he spent a good many of his later years in the old soldiers' home, which used to stand where the Department of Motor Vehicles is now. But in the interval, he was a newspaperman. He was not prominent. The reason we're here is simply to track the Raleigh Register. But he did work for a newspaper after the war, I think as a result of his father's influence. Now, John Syme, his dad, eventually moved the Raleigh Register back to Richmond during the war, and that is where the Raleigh Register died. Why? Because Syme could not get supplies during the Civil War that a newspaper needs to function. So the Raleigh Register met its end, not in Raleigh at all, but in our neighboring state. All right, we're in Magnolia Hill now. You remember when we were in City Cemetery, we looked at a third newspaper man and your quiz of the day was to name the paper that he, that is Thomas Meredith, founded and is still going here in Raleigh. And the answer is on the stone. This is the family stone of the family that took over that newspaper. And Robin will pan in and show you the answer. And yes, in the 1870s, Thomas Meredith's newspaper, The Biblical Recorder, was taken over by the Bailey family, specifically Christopher Bailey, and he edited it for some 20 years through the 1880s into the 1890s. And as far as we know, the Biblical Recorder is still going strong. Now, in the 1890s, Christopher Bailey was joined by his son, Josiah William Bailey, who has a remarkable history of his own. And he's here in the family plot too. Robin making the circuit around to Josiah William Bailey. He began as an assistant to his father when only a teenager, and when his dad died, Josiah Bailey offered to stay with the paper for a little while just to make sure that the subsequent issues were published, but it turns out he stayed with it for another 7 or 8 years, which I think interrupted his planned career for a time. But afterwards, he left the paper around 1907 or 1908 and took up law. Law turned into politics, as it so often does, and in 1930 he was elected one of the United States senators from the state of North Carolina, and he served until he died in office in 1946. Josiah William Bailey and his family, newspaper people. The Biblical Recorder, you may think, doesn't fit the mold of the typical newspaper, and in a way it doesn't. But it's not full of just theology, it's full of news. And as a researcher, I've used the Biblical Recorder to research information that might have relatively little to do with the Baptist Church. But nevertheless, long-running, important newspaper in the history of Raleigh. All right, one of the rules of thumb, informal rule about newspapers in Raleigh is that in times of political turmoil, the number of papers increases. And that makes sense because people, again, many of them start newspapers to promote a particular political view. Most of them very short-lived. You're going to see an example of that in a few minutes. And often these little newspapers, these short-lived newspapers, had strange names. Spirit of the Age was one of them. Friends of Temperance was another. You know what their editorial position was just by looking at the front page. And I don't make these things up, folks. There was a newspaper during the Civil War era called Blasting Powder. But you cannot talk about newspapers of the Civil War era, which obviously generated a good deal of print, without talking about the North Carolina Standard. And you can't talk about the North Carolina Standard, which was a newspaper begun in the 1830s, without talking about somebody you already met, and that is William Woods Holden. We've talked about him. Yes, he was the governor who was impeached and dismissed from office as a result. But he began as a newspaper man. He grew up in Hillsboro, and instead of going to school, he was apprenticed to a newspaper. He was apprenticed ultimately to the Standard, which he wound up controlling for many years. In fact, he was with the Standard, associated with the Standard during many of his years in politics, and only gave it up, I believe, in 1868. But it was founded, as I think I said, in the 1830s. So another old paper, but not one that stayed with us since that era. Now, he used the Standard to promote his particular personal political views, and that varied over the years, which is what got him in so much trouble with just about everybody. Before the war, in the years before the Civil War, he was a firm advocate for secession, and he conveyed that in the pages of the Standard. He voted for secession as a representative of Wake County in one of the conventions. During the war, as you know, because we've talked about it, he shifted his position and became a leader of the peace faction, and used the paper to promote a settlement of the war as early as 1863. That got him in trouble. In 1863, a regiment of Georgia Confederate troops came through Raleigh. They had heard of this fellow, William Holden, and his peace work, and they would have nothing of it. And they burned the office of the Standard, of the newspaper. Short-sightedly, they forgot to destroy his presses, so even though he lost his office, he could continue publishing his newspaper till well into the 1860s, when he finally gave it up. But I think newspapers were his first love, and even though we scorn him for his various positions regarding secession and so forth, I think he was genuinely interested and used the paper to illustrate his sympathy for folks in need, the working man, rights for women, all sorts of social causes were part of the Standard and part of William Woods Holden's beliefs. Very important in the history of newspapers in North Carolina. All right, we've been talking about short-lived newspapers that were started largely for political purposes, and we're at the gravesite of one John Nichols, who's a good illustration of that. Now, you've met John Nichols already, you just don't remember that you have. Why? Because his occupation was a printer. He was a printer, and it was his firm in 1869 that printed the multicolored Engelhart proposed design for Oakwood Cemetery. But Nichols' interest extended beyond printing. He became, in fact, a great fan of William Woods Holden, and you saw, as Robin panned over here, that he is just a few steps away from Mr. Holden. John Nichols considered himself, like Holden, a radical Republican, and he started a newspaper in 1871 along with his partner John Gorman. Was Nichols and Gorman was the printing firm. In fact, he married John Gorman's daughter. He started the Daily Telegram, I think, to promote his own political career. And he and Mr. Gorman ran the Daily Telegram for about 6 months. And then they gave it up. Why? Historians tell us they gave it up because the family insisted. Neither man had time for his work, his regular job, for his family, and for his civic duties, and so the family insisted that they shut down the paper. So here's one of those 6-month wonders, but I think it helped John Nichols to get his name out there in front of the public, because he was elected as a U.S. Congressman. He served one term, a radical Republican, very friendly to labor, the working man, laboring interests, John Nichols. All right, we're in the Johnson section on Chapel Circle, just off Chapel Circle. And to talk about newspapers in the post-war years, again, another politically tumultuous time which generated a lot of interest in newspapers. And one of several big names from that era, right here, this is Samuel Ashe. Samuel Ashe, a soldier during the war. After the war, he studied law and followed the logical sequence. Study law, get into politics, and since politics and newspapers were so closely related, he left politics and went into the newspaper business. He bought a paper, a struggling paper, called the Raleigh Observer, and turned it around, made a success out of it. This was in the late 1870s, and did so well with it that he went out and bought another struggling paper. That was the Daily News. And he combined the two, the Daily News and the Raleigh Observer, into the News and Observer. And it's Samuel Ashe, of course, who created that paper. In fact, we held up a sample of it earlier, because it's still with us today under different ownership. He eventually sold it to another man who made a somewhat large name in Raleigh newspapers, and we're going to meet him next. But Samuel Ashe, very important, and I would like to say one thing. One of the things that he liked to do with his newspapers was to write historical pieces about Raleigh history that he then published sort of as sidebars, I guess, in his newspaper. Tuck that away for later on. All right, we're at the gravesite in Section A of the man who eventually ran the News and Observer, as you probably know, no secret. This is the gravesite of Josephus Daniels. In 1894, some folks got together and wanted a newspaper that would become, in a way, replace the North Carolina Standard, which was the old voice of the Democratic Party in North Carolina. They wanted a new newspaper to replace the old, though I'm not sure that connection is official. But the News and Observer that you saw had been started by Samuel Ashe became available, and several men got together, raised the money, bought the paper, and turned it over to Josephus Daniels on his guarantee that the newspaper would continue to support the Democratic Party. And it did, very faithfully, right up until the 1940s when Josephus passed away. Josephus used his newspaper to support any number of social causes, everything from temperance, he was very anti-alcohol, to labor, the rights of labor, women's suffrage. He was a big promoter of women's suffrage. The best story about Josephus, the best story of many about Josephus Daniels, though, involves the time after he was Secretary of the Navy. As you probably know, Woodrow Wilson appointed him Secretary of the Navy, which he served through World War I. And after the war, he wanted a deck gun, a gun that had been off of a captured German ship, placed in his front yard. And the Navy Department told him, "I'm sorry, sir, but you can only put a gun on a naval base." Well, he had his home in Hayes Barton declared a naval base, the smallest naval base in the country, perhaps the smallest naval base in the world, and had that deck gun, unless it's been moved lately, it's still there, placed there as a memento of his days with the Navy. And the story was that not only did the gun sit there, but he had it pointed at the home of his great newspaper rival, who also lived in Hayes Barton. And that's our next stop. Come with us.
Hey, Bruce, you're on.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Robin. So I was just reading the story in the paper about Epic, which is going to expand its headquarters in Cary, an electronics company. I'm reading about it in the newspaper. A little bit of irony there. We were talking about the News and Observer and its rival, and Josephus Daniels, with his deck gun in his front yard, pointed at the man who owned his rival newspaper. And that was the home of John Alsey Park. You've met John Park earlier. In one of our discussions of NC State, I believe. He was a graduate of North Carolina A&M, class of 1905, I think, and he's the one who became very interested in automobiles. In fact, he had one of the first car dealerships in Raleigh. But another one of his great loves was the newspaper. In 1911, he bought a paper that was for sale, the Raleigh Times. And the old Raleigh story is that he had to pay for it in gold, I don't know why, and that the night before the final sale, bank tellers around the city were sitting on the floors of their banks counting out gold coins, sort of drained the Raleigh gold supply for a time. Anyway, Park ran the paper for many years into the 1950s, and it was the conservative rival of Josephus Daniels and the News and Observer. Now, the News and Observer was quite blatantly the Democratic Party organ. The Raleigh Times was not a Republican Party newspaper, but it was a conservative one. You still had the conservative rival of a much more liberal News and Observer. And Park's interest, he had less of a political axe to grind, I think it's fair to say, but he wanted his newspaper interesting. So what did he do? He was something of an adventurer, and he would travel places around the world, keep a journal, write up his trips, and send those descriptions back to publish in the newspaper in an effort to keep the public interested. Now, the Raleigh Times had an Achilles heel, if you will. It had a weakness, and its problem was it was an afternoon paper. The News and Observer is a morning paper, and afternoon papers fell out of favor over the years. I think people wanted their news early in the day, and the readership declined to the point where Park lost that battle with Josephus Daniels, because the News and Observer purchased the Raleigh Times in the 1950s and kept it running to, I say the 1950s, I'm not even sure of that date, but they kept it running till 1989, when I think the last Raleigh Times newspaper was published. John Park, as you can see, passed away by then. Anyway, another chapter in Raleigh newspapers from a man who has many, many colorful stories about it. We just barely scratched the surface.
What about the picture?
The picture, yes, thank you. You can tell I'm really on the ball today. Some of you have eaten at this restaurant, the Raleigh Times, down on East Hargett Street. This was considered one of the most advanced print shops, I guess, in North Carolina. John Park made sure it was well outfitted, and this, I guess, is from the, well, the building dates from the 1870s, I believe, but not, of course, when the Times was being printed there. But handsome building. All right, the people we've talked about so far in our history of Raleigh newspapers are the owners, the controllers, the people who ran the papers. And before we leave that segment of the newspaper story, there's certainly one more that needs to be mentioned, but it's someone that you've met several times already, so we won't go back for a visit. And that's Clarence Hamilton Poe. Remember Clarence Poe? He's the fellow associated with NC State, associated with all manner of activities here in Raleigh. And his business, if you will, was the ownership of the Progressive Farmer, another very influential, very important newspaper, and probably, in terms of its circulation, bigger than any that we've talked about here, not only in Raleigh, but throughout the state of North Carolina, and southeast, nationwide, if you will. So, one more newspaper man that we can't forget. But those newspapers, whether big or small, produced journalists who made reputations on their own as reporters and writers and so forth, and we're going to talk about a few of those before we close up for the day. And one very big name, it's not a name that you hear a great deal of now, but everybody in North Carolina knew it in the middle of the last century, and that's Tom Bost, William Thomas Bost. He was the city editor for the News and Observer for a time, but I think his chief loyalty was to the Greensboro Daily News. He would send them dispatches from Raleigh. He was a political reporter. In fact, he was called the Dean of North Carolina political reporters for some 40 years. He's the kind of fellow who hung around the Capitol all the time. All the legislators knew him. He's the kind of guy they would leak stories to. He's the guy the sort of guy they would consult with, a man who was, in a way, as much a part of government as the people that we elect. Very important in the newspaper business from the reporting end. Tom Bost. All right, another journalist, in a way, I guess her own way, more colorful in a way than Tom Bost, but certainly worth a mention here. Nell Battle Lewis, named Battlin Nell, was a reporter and a columnist for the Raleigh Times as well as the News and Observer for many years in the middle of the 20th century. She, a Raleigh girl, she went to Smith College up in New England, and during World War I she was with the YWCA as a canteen worker in France, serving American troops. When she came back, she went to work with newspapers. A very strong personality, a woman with some very firm, for a time anyway, beliefs, very progressive, if you will. She supported some pet projects of hers for her whole life, in fact. Prison reform, mental health care, labor unions she supported for a time, were just some of her causes. In the 1930s, she began to change. People noticed a different tone in her column. Her column was called Incidentally. The column, incidentally, ran in the society sections of the newspapers, but people read it for her vigorous opinions on all matters of social topics. And that began to change in the 1930s. In fact, much of her viewpoint turned from what we would consider very liberal today to very conservative later on. She began to fear what she thought was the influence of communism among the labor union movements, and thought of her earlier stance, her earlier support for labor and some of her other causes as a bit naive. Now this, as you might imagine, knowing what you know about the News and Observer, didn't sit well with the N&O, which continued to be a progressive newspaper, but they were generous with her and let her say her piece. So again, a woman who began on one side of the political spectrum, and with the exception of a few of her pet causes, which she kept her whole life, such as mental health, she had changed. Battlin Nell, a woman with a very colorful personality, as I said, a book just a few years old, I think underscores her importance. And it's an interesting book to read, not only for Nell, but given her job here in the state capitol, it's full of information about other people too. So, rather interesting story. Nell Lewis. All right, we've come to Chapel Circle now to meet somebody who, again, illustrates all manner of folks who were part of the newspaper industry for at least a time. This is Elizabeth Reid Murray. Everything she did, it seemed, in her career had to do with writing. She taught school, she taught English at Broughton for a time. She wrote for WPTF, and she was an editor and writer, columnist for the News Observer for a time. But that's not what she's known for. She's remembered for, speaking of books, a 2-volume history of Wake, capital county of North Carolina, a very readable book, and those of you who have it, I'm sure, use it the way we do, and that is as a reference book. It is wonderfully documented, a wonderfully thorough story of Raleigh and its history for from the beginning up to the middle of the last century anyway. Anyway, Elizabeth Reid Murray, another newspaper woman turned historian. We are still just off of Chapel Circle to talk about someone else that you've met before in a slightly different context. If you look at down below Fred Old's name here and his dates, you see the two things that he's remembered for. And the last time you were here, if you were with us, you remember that Fred Olds was the fellow who made that great collection of historical papers and items that reflected the history of Raleigh, and that became the basis of the collection for the North Carolina Museum of History. But you see what's, I think, above it, and that is journalist, because his job, as opposed to his hobby, was as initially a reporter, and he wrote for Sam Ashe's Daily News. eventually became part of the News and Observer, because that's what happened to Ashe's newspaper. He was a columnist, a feature writer, and an editor for many years for the News and Observer. And again, he loved to do history on the side, but that was something that his career with the newspaper had influenced. Why? Because Sam Ashe did the same thing. Samuel Ashe used to collect documentation of North Carolina history, and he used to write articles for his newspapers. Fred Olds apparently picked up on that from Samuel Ashe, and he began doing the same thing. So in a way, you see the sequence that became the North Carolina Museum of History. It goes from Samuel Ashe, if you will, through Fred Olds and onto the museum. A sequence there that certainly involves newspapers. All right, thanks for sticking with us. We're almost done the tour, but we're going to make a quick stop again at somebody you know, but probably the best known journalist nationally and even internationally in the cemetery. That, of course, is Vermont, Connecticut Royster, one of the Royster Candy family. Went to UNC, became a destroyer captain during the Second World War, but of course best known as the longtime editor of the Wall Street Journal, Pulitzer Prize twice, Pulitzer Prize winner, professor of journalism at UNC. We couldn't do this tour without stopping at Vermont Royster. People, I think, didn't know he had a middle name. But anyway, a Raleigh boy who certainly contributed mightily to our newspaper history. Vermont Royster. We are in the Beechwood section now for our last stop, and we've chosen this this reporter, if you will, intentionally because he has special meaning for us here at the cemetery, and we thought perhaps in a different way he might have special meaning for some of you, especially if you're big sports fans, because we're going to talk here about a sports writer. This is Anthony McKevlin, Tony McKevlin. He was from Charleston, grew up in Charleston, went to the College of Charleston, went to work for a newspaper in Charleston, and in the 1920s wound up here in Raleigh as a sports writer for the N&O. And in a way, he reflects one of the themes that we followed with NC State, that is the growth of big-time athletics. Because I think you can see it in Tony McKevlin's columns, which are a lot of fun to read for many reasons. But he was not a big fan of basketball, for instance, in the beginning, and if you know about early collegiate basketball, you know why. It was a slow game. After every basket, you had to go back out to center court for a jump ball. The scores were very low. It didn't interest him. He loved baseball, football, but basketball, he really didn't seem to take a real liking to until later on in his career. Very, very popular sports writer. Another thing he loved, and it would make a lot of fun in his columns, is trivia. One of the questions he grappled with of great import for a time was, what was the name of the major league catcher who threw the first, who caught the first baseball thrown off the top of the Washington Monument? So anyway, a lot of fun. And again, when you think about sports writers and big-time sports, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Did the sports writers writing about sports create big-time sports, or did big-time sports simply feed material to sports writers like Tony McKevlin? Anyway, he died in 1946. And in the 1950s, the ACC, remembering him, established a sports award. This is one reason why we thought it might be meaningful to those of you who follow big-time ACC sports. The McKevlin Award. Originally, it went to the athlete on any of the ACC schools who was considered the athlete of the year. Now, since 1990s, it's been to the male athlete. Females have their own award. It's not the McKevlin Award. But the McKevlin Award, I read somewhere, has now gone to 7 athletes who became NBA first draft picks and at least one Heisman Trophy winner. I don't know if that was Phillip Rivers or not. I don't know if he won the Heisman, but he won the McKevlin Award one year. Michael Jordan. So big athletic award in this man's name. He would have been a fun man to know. He taught himself to type and supposedly had lightning speed on a typewriter, and just by coincidence, the photo we have of this man, if that isn't a classic journalist at work. But the other reason that we wanted to finish up with Tony McKevlin is because he has special meaning here in the cemetery. He married a woman named Betsy Forrest, who is the granddaughter of Asa Forrest, who many of you know if you've spent time with our cemetery. For 40 years was the superintendent of Oakwood Cemetery and is largely responsible for many of the trees here, but the whole general beautiful garden aspect that we have. So, again, Tony McKevlin, we thought, good man to finish up with. And just as we close, we want to make a little shout out to our local newspapers. They have always been important to Oakwood Cemetery. You probably are not aware that there is very little internal records here from before 1940. So even to learn the history of our cemetery, we need to use the public record. And when you say public record, that certainly includes primarily newspapers. So newspaper stories have been important to Oakwood, just so we know more about Oakwood. Of course, they're important to us. Obituaries convey news that's of interest to us and of interest to the public. And some features. Many of you read and appreciate, I know, some of the features that Josh Schaefer does for the News and Observer. He's a regular. He jogs through Oakwood, does our tours and so forth. So we're very much appreciative of the role of newspapers today. I suspect we're going to have to learn to evolve into the electronic age, as Robin is doing right at the moment. But that's still to come. Anyway, we hope you've enjoyed our talk today. It ran a little long, but then there's a lot to say about newspapers. Thanks for coming.